You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the integration pacesetter, Joe Mosher.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosher. Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend your time with us today. One of the things that I've been observing as we come out of the last several years of just historic volatility and uncertainty and a lot of opportunities, but a lot of risks and threats as well, is there's a return to safety, a flight to quality aspect to the way people are making decisions these days. And we've talked about this in previous episodes of the podcast. But one of the ways that this is increasingly showing up in the conversations that I'm having with clients and with companies is a focus on improving the strength of their balance sheets, which seems like a pretty universally good thing, right? Everyone wants to have a strong balance sheet for a variety of reasons. And we hear these old adages get thrown around about, you want to fortify your balance sheet. You want to be ready to weather the storm before it arrives. You want to fix the roof while the sun is shining. A lot of adages they're meaningful, they're very illustrative of good practices, and frankly, I've used them myself quite a bit over time. But what we need to take a step back and think about, what is a balance sheet actually meant to do? What does it signal? And what is the objective of balance sheet strength? And so that's something I want to talk about today. And before we jump into a couple of observations that I have, let's just do a very quick recap in layman's terms of why we even care about balance sheets and what does it mean to have balance sheet strength. And so a strong balance sheet, really, if you think about it from how do you manage your business, is about things like maintaining adequate cash levels. You want to maintain liquidity. It's about managing your liabilities and making sure that you are limiting exposure to risky counterparties, that you control your liabilities, you have line of sight to what they are, and that they are not in excess of your actual assets on the asset side of the balance sheet. In addition to quality assets, you also want to look at the amount of leverage and make sure that you're taking advantage of favorable debt when it's available, or reducing your debt exposure when perhaps terms and conditions are less favorable. And so in the pursuit of improving your balance sheet strength, this shows up in a lot of different ways. People will work to shorten their collection terms as a way to pull in the AR sooner. They may look at extending their payment terms with their suppliers as a way to keep cash on the balance sheet and delay as long as possible before they have to pay on their debts. It's about managing inventory levels on forward purchases of seeds or inputs or fuel or equipment or whatever it is that you might need. And also make sure you're not overbuying your needs, even when prices or terms might entice you to do so. You hedge your grain and commodity positions to minimize your downside risk. You're thoughtful about how you issue credit to counterparties. And you think about, how do we make sure we're not funding operations with short-term debt that could expose us to sudden changes in the market condition. And so all of this taken together, why do we care? In the end, a strong balance sheet is about driving the financial discipline into how the business is operated and ensuring that you retain sufficient earnings or cash to fund your strategy, to be able to finance your objectives and ultimately to fuel your growth. But here's the thing. There's all sorts of problems with a strong balance sheet. And now, I'm not advocating that balance sheets are not a key financial indicator of the health and solvency of your company. I'm certainly not saying that a balance sheet is not important. But like many things, taken to an extreme, the push for impenetrable balance sheet, complete dominance in this aspect of your business can have some adverse effects. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, to kind of jar us out of a sense of a place of complacency or too many assumptions and really kind of challenge our own thinking. So the first thing that I want to mention today or comment on is one of the first problems with a balance sheet, a strong balance sheet, is that it provides you with the luxury of surviving subpar execution. So a balance sheet can be nefarious and counterproductive when it's an overused strength in your business. And what do I mean by that? When you've got the cushion and the buffer of huge cash reserves, of strong assets, of limited liabilities, what it does, it allows you to absorb all sorts of unforced errors. It dilutes the pain of underperformance and missing opportunities. And frankly, it robs you of that pressure to respond swiftly when some aspect of your business is not hitting results, whether that's a trader taking unfavorable positions and realizing losses, a plant manager that's not performing and meeting customer expectations, a department head making poor investment decisions, a divisional VP turning in lackluster results, whatever it is, it kind of dilutes the pain that you could be feeling from not delivering optimal results. And sometimes when you avoid the pain, you also have a hard time finding the urgency to respond. And so I've heard it said many times in my career that a black P&L hides a lot of issues and lots of issues, mistakes, and opportunities. And I think a strong balance sheet can do the same thing. So some examples. If you have huge cash on hand, that can create the conditions in which maybe you don't pay enough attention to what the cash conversion cycle is in your business and what it should be, right? You've removed the pressure of having adequate liquidity because you've maintained these excessive cash positions, and suddenly you're missing these opportunities to improve your cash conversion cycle. Low debt levels, for example, are something that can be celebrated. I mean, who doesn't like to have low debt typically? But this comes at the expense of maybe not identifying that there's opportunities to use some favorable leverage to support growth. You can't be overly preoccupied with zero debt and expect to also be able to identify and capitalize on the opportunities the market might provide. And abundant retained earnings. They feel like this soft, plush cushion, but maybe that means that you haven't returned enough of those earnings to ownership or investors, or more likely, you might be prioritizing the comfort of these large balances over reinvesting back in the business with CapEx and capital for acquisitions. And this brings me to my second point. A strong balance sheet is also kind of a creature of self-promotion. It is its own best hype man, if you will. What I mean by that is a strong balance sheet and that sense of comfort and the covering fire that it provides that I just talked about, it kind of creates its own center of gravity. And I think it convinces you over time to extend that sense of comfort beyond its logical boundaries. So once you get into a position of strength, once you get into a position where you've controlled your liabilities, you have abundant and quality assets on the books, whether that's through inventory or IP or whatever that might be, once you have adequate cash on hand, that doesn't really incentivize risk-taking, which is kind of the objective, right? You want to get into a place of strength so you can take smart risks. But rather than incentivizing risk-taking, it sort of feeds upon itself. And suddenly the objective of building a strong balance sheet, which is to put your business in a position where it's not just solvent, but it can withstand turbulence and capture opportunities, the objective shifts and becomes about sustaining balance sheet strength, stripped away of those original objectives. So it's kind of like this corrosive inertia that I feel like fogs up our perspectives. So maybe put a better way is over time that objective of strengthening your balance sheet to enable growth morphs into the objective of strengthening the balance sheet is just to keep strengthening the balance sheet. And so I think that one of the ironic things here, one of the paradoxes is that being in a strong position for growth can weirdly erode your appetite for growth. The focus of getting the strength morphs into a focus on keeping the strength, even when maintaining that strength is counter to the things you need to do to grow the business.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
And the final thing I want to say today is, in my experience, a strong balance sheet, as desirable as that is, and as effective as it is at risk-proofing your business, taken to an extreme, it strips you of the juice or the rush of running lean. And now I'm not going to romanticize the idea of running a business where solvency and surviving until tomorrow is not guaranteed, right? That's not pressure or conditions that anybody really can thrive in long term. Yeah, it's a rush, making payroll at the last minute, shipping product at the last moment, eking out enough margin to survive to fight the next quarter. That's a rush, but it's one that can break you over time. So what I'm talking about here is the clarity of focus and the cleansing sense of prioritization that comes when the long-term viability of your business is not assured. A strong balance sheet can deprive you of that. Think about conditions where failing to execute is fatal to the business. What do you learn and discover? You discover that people can dig deep. Teams can accomplish amazing things. They can take the business from the brink and suddenly get into a position of sustained growth. And just the pride and satisfaction and sense of collective purpose that comes of that, that's completely stripped away when you have a strong balance sheet. You don't have that opportunity because that pressure is removed. And keep in mind that diamonds are formed due to the pressure applied, not from a lack of pressure. And so some stress applied to the business is a good thing. And I think about this maybe as a metaphor here for those of you that are old enough to have watched Seinfeld, whether when it was live or in syndication. It always makes me think about that episode where Kramer is driving a used car around with a salesman. The salesman's along for the ride, and he shows him what it's like to really feel alive when you run the gas dial far below empty, right? When you're always pushing for that extra mile. It's kind of like this Thelma and Louise moment as they pass one gas station with the belief that they can make it to the next one. And so I get a little anxious just thinking about that. That's not how I'm wired. But again, running on the edge, running under conditions of pressure and stress can reveal a lot about what your business is capable of. And I think that's an important thing to think about when we think about balance sheet strength and how far to take it. If you over-index on the security provided by a strong balance sheet, I really fear that you're exerting all your effort to ultimately keep uncertainty at arm's length. And uncertainty can be opportunity as well. So it's not a universally good thing. Okay, so what? Right? So what should you do about this? If you're looking in the mirror and you're saying, yes, perhaps we have become preoccupied with getting to a position of strength and we haven't thought enough about how do we leverage that strength for growth. This is where I have to admit that I'm a pretty lousy messenger on the topic because I also really love a strong balance sheet. It gives me comfort, right? It strips away the uncertainty. It provides the perception of stability. And I'm generally completely drawn to de-risking business. And so this is one of my big opportunities to improve. So I'm actually short on advice here. And what I will say is if my financial advisor is listening to this episode, then he already has a headache from all the eye rolling he's been doing. He knows well my risk aversion, and he knows that when it's unchecked, it really knows no bounds. And he reminds me on a regular basis how divorced my own cash management practices in the business are from what any reasonably clear-headed entrepreneur would do. So in other words, he knows that in this house, the cobbler's kids have no shoes. So maybe that's the point. Maybe this is entirely a pep talk to myself. Maybe this is me giving myself a kick in the backside. But again, in the conversations I've been having with those of you in agribusiness, I suspect there's something here for many of you too, particularly in the smaller size companies. We're coming out of this multi-year period of just intense volatility and persistent uncertainty. And I think it has many of us frazzled at the ends, and maybe we're a little dull and fatigued in our thinking. And perhaps at a time like this, it's good to get back to the basics and, yes, look at things like the quality of your assets. Look at the risk profile of your liabilities. But then in the context of doing that, looking at your cash levels. But as you do that, make sure that you're using your balance sheet for its intended purpose. And that's to fuel growth. It's not only a defensive measure. Balance sheet strength is about offense. So I'm going to leave you with this today. A couple of key points to take away. Any overused strength can become a risk, and balance sheets are no different. A strong balance sheet, one of the issues with it is it insulates you from the healthy and acute discomfort of underperforming, right? It dulls the senses. It creates conditions where you may accept lackluster performance more than you otherwise would. A strong balance sheet tends to try and perpetuate itself, and it takes itself beyond its logical boundaries and eventually will act at odds with your own business interests. And a strong balance sheet also can deprive you of that rush of getting the job done, of performing, of winning, of surviving, when survival was not guaranteed, where the safety net was uncertain. So perhaps the through line here is all good things in moderation, including a focus on fortifying your balance sheet as we come into a period now of what I believe will be economic growth after the last several years of a lot of uncertainty and some challenging conditions. So thank you as always for listening in today. A reminder to like and subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And I encourage you to connect with me, Joe Mosher, on LinkedIn. Or if you need to, set up a call with me directly by visiting Mosher Consulting Group online at moshercg.com. Thank you for joining us today, and have a safe day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.